Welcome to the last session, to the last panel of the conference. And after a glimpse of daylight outside, we can manage 2 more hours. The panel now is about online content distribution and new ways of content distribution. And the first one on the panel is Rudolf Leschka, and he will take the ball from what we've discussed this morning and also go into DSM and a little bit the conflicting aims of DSM. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. I'll talk about the collective rights management, which is an incredibly boring topic, but an important one. So I'm sorry if you will be bored, but I will try to make it entertaining, or as much as I can. I don't know how much are you familiar with collective rights management, but basically, as you know, this is mainly in, historically it has developed on the European continent, but it's a widespread way how to license certain uses of copyrighted material, not only works, but also related rights like sound recordings and so on. Collective rights management is important there, where it's impractical for some reasons to license it individually, but it serves many other functions. It's not only the administration of rights for the authors, artists, and other rights holders. It's also an important service for the users. So if you are operating an online platform, or if you are operating a cinema, or if you are operating a TV station, you might need to get a blanket license to use, for instance, world repertoire in your radio, TV station, or online platform, for instance, for music. And then you don't have to clear the rights individually. So it's not only a convenient way how to obtain rights, it's also a very cheap way, basically, because of course in this way it is cheaper than if you would have to negotiate individually. It's a tremendous reduction of transactional costs of both parties, and it basically serves as one-stop shop for certain uses. Again, it's not for every kind of use, and but basically those where these blanket licenses are required, or in terms of concerts, there's no blanket license, there's an individual license, but it has historically developed. I will not go into details. I will focus more on the policy issues which are related to this. Also, collective rights management is important for policing the authorized and unauthorized use, and also, and this is part of my speech, it serves some cultural, social, and educational functions, which means that it serves the local authors, artists, and by investing into activities or providing services which are beneficial for the local community. The CMOs, the collecting management organizations, are authorized by the international practice to deduct certain amount of the collected money for such purposes. It should not be more than 10% under the practice. Usually it's less, but there is this way of how they contribute to the local development as well. So basically, the CMOs form a vital part of the creative ecosystem, and although they are private entities, they serve important public benefits, and important public good for the benefit of authors, but also users and at the end, the consumers. So, first, I would outline some features that were traditionally typical for collective rights management. First of all, the territoriality. So the collecting organizations used, or well, mostly they still used to work only in the territory of their establishment, and they license rights only for their territory of operation, obviously. Usually and traditionally, they operated in many countries as either natural or legal monopolies, because they were created as associations of authors, usually. So in order to create the monopoly, but the monopoly was not only an evil when someone hears the term monopoly, but it served the very basic functions of the collecting management, because if you are a user, you don't want to go to 5 different or 10 different collecting organizations, as is the case in many countries actually, or in some countries. You would prefer perhaps to have to negotiate only with one organization. Also, the monopoly in some countries, or in the United States, for instance, was created, or it's more complicated, but to make it simple, the collective management in the US was created to fight the potential abusement of monopoly or of rights holders. So there, the federal authorities basically said, hey, we have problems with licensing music for, at that time, that were like mechanical machines, which were in the pubs and so on, and when they were playing music, they were only playing music which was licensed to them on these there was a medium you had to buy, and that was licensed by the music publisher, and the music publishers were basically requiring that you take only music from them for your machines and so on, and that was creating monopolies or oligopolies, let's say. And then the US said, hey, we will have an organization which will license these rights and which will be forced to license. So there's a legal duty for the collecting for a CMO to license the subject matter, so that the exclusive rights of the author, of the publisher, cannot be abused when when someone is asked for a license. Traditionally, also, a CMO represented all administered rights for all represented authors, which means that if you were an author or a publisher, you could not do the cherry picking. You were, providing the CMO with your full rights, to the extent in which it was administered. And that also served an important public benefit, because, for instance, if you want to do a Beatles cover, if you want to make a CD to sing songs made popular by Beatles, you just go to a CMO. You will pay a small fee, a percentage from your sales, and you can do it. And if you want to sing a Beatles song on the stage, you can do it by getting the license. That's a great, achievement of the collecting management, because it was based on the idea that the author cannot, for instance, prohibit live concerts, but keeping royalties from TV stations, for instance, so that he had either to provide the rights as they were, or not being represented at all. Nowadays, these some of these traditional features are being changed in Europe, and that's where I want to talk about it more. Since 1990s in the European Union, there was recognition of the collective rights management in the EU law, in several directives. But as we see, the European Commission later started to develop the idea of an internal market or of a unified market also for copyrighted goods. The problem of the territoriality, the problem of the territoriality was always there, and the collecting management organizations, as far the internet is concerned, they found a way how to solve the problem in the so-called Santiago Agreement in the year of 2000. Basically, the idea of the agreement was that any of the participating CMOs, which were the most of them, can grant you nearly worldwide rights in and to the world repertoire of music, which means that if you were operating a platform either in the Czech Republic, in Germany, or in wherever, you could get a license for the world use of the music. The only condition which turned out to be the problem for the Commission was that you, as the operator, you had to come to that CMO which is operating in your territory. No, which means that you couldn't, if you were based in Prague, you couldn't get to GEMA. You couldn't go to GEMA to get the license. You had to apply for the license in the Czech Republic. Well, Commission believed that this hampers the achievement of a genuine single market, and started investigation, and later found that this agreement is in violation of the EU competition laws. And after 13 years of legal disputes, this decision of the Commission was annulled by the General Court, by the EU judiciary. And basically, the General Court said, well, no, this is not illegal because it served important public benefit and it just made sense. And the court upheld the original agreement. Unfortunately, we have in Europe lost 13 years of development of the digital single market by these steps of the Commission, and in the meantime, Commission was trying to remedy what it has done. So the Commission has not allowed the market to find its own solution of the problem, and the Commission in the meantime was trying to develop a regulatory solution to the problem it itself created. Interestingly, in 2004, there was a resolution of the European Parliament on the collective management, and the European Parliament is saying what I am saying here, basically, that the collective management serves important public benefits, cultural diversity, and that the territoriality is a part of the solution, not of the problem. Anyway, later in 2006, there was this Internal Market Directive Services, Internal Market Services Directive, which basically was applied to most of the services. The Commission took the view that it applies also to collective management. Again, in 2014, the judiciary said that the Commission was wrong. And after these series of lost battles in courts, the Commission came at the end with the directive. And the directive is trying to do through legislation what the Commission was not able to do through the executive decisions. And the directive is enacting certain rules, such as allowing multi-territorial licenses for online rights, but only for some CMOs. So the directive is creating two different types of CMOs, the small one and the bigger one, which are authorized to grant multi-territorial licenses. And also it allows the right holders to pick up the repertoire or a part of it. So you as an author, or importantly as a publisher, you didn't have to be represented for your whole repertoire. You could say that you want to have only your less popular repertoire represented, and the other one you could pick and also you could withhold the representation for certain uses. So this created a complete mess, because nowadays, and that's a thing which we talked about in the previous panel, because those are the aims which are conflicting, and which the Commission tries to ensure diversity and tries to ensure flourishing culture, but on the other hand, it creates oligopolies, and it is establishing an oligopoly, or confirming it for the major music publishers such as Sony and Universal, which will license directly the most popular repertoire, while the less popular repertoire will be kept with the CMOs. This means that as a CMO, you will administer the less popular repertoire, you will have less money, you will have a more expensive administration. This means you will have bigger deductions from the money paid to the authors and artists. This means that you will have more pricey rights, you will have more expensive licenses for the users, and all the advantage goes to major publishers and major platforms like Apple, Google, or Spotify, which are lucky, to have the direct deals with the major publishers for more competitive prices and so on. And of course, this means also that your less popular repertoire might not be that played and so on. Importantly, it is the new directive is limiting the national autonomy in the field of culture, because through setting the extent of the CRM and through the regulatory framework, the member states were able to really shape their own cultural policy, and this is quite limited now. So why I believe it is endangering the diversity is that the money do not remain all in the country of the use of the work. The money are shifting to the major licensing platforms, to the pan-European platforms. And the competition between the licensing bodies and between the CMOs is not helping to preserve this desired diversity, which the Commission is proclaiming in the digital single market to achieve. Generally speaking, I don't know what the solution would be actually, because I don't believe that we can have any amendment of the CRM directive in the future. But at least I want to say that the member states have lost an important part of their autonomy in the field of culture, which traditionally under the EU law framework was really reserved for the member states, because basically there's very little room for the EU under the EU law to regulate the culture. So yeah, that's it basically. Thank you. The time's out.
Thank you very much. I already have questions, but we are going on now with Ivan David, also a lawyer, and he will talk about the balance in the negotiations between authors and producers. And the floor is yours.
So I was asked, as was said already, about the subject of negotiations between authors and producers in the audiovisual industry, and specifically in the Czech Republic. I don't know if this topic is anyhow connected with anything else which was in the conference. Perhaps not. But let's hope that it somehow speaks about the topics which are, let's say, common for other subject that was already discussed today and yesterday. Anyhow, my paper has two parts. Firstly, I will, in short, introduce the concept of film production in the Czech Copyright Act, because as far as I know, it was not explained here earlier, and perhaps we should know at least a little bit about how the legal framework deals with it in the Czech Republic. And secondly, I will speak about most frequently addressed issues in these negotiations between authors and producers. I picked up 7 most, from my point of view, major issues of these negotiations. Of course, we could pick up 10 or 50 or 100, but then the bore would never end. So it's only 7 of them. So firstly, let's just explain how it works according to the Czech Copyright Act. According to this act, only the principal director of the film is the sole author of the final audiovisual work, and all other authors are the authors of the so-called audiovisually utilized works. The producer then is the owner of the special right called the right to the first fixation of the film, which he has automatically by law just by making this first fixation. But of course, the producer needs the whole bundle of rights to sell them to distributors and users. And therefore, the Czech Copyright Act states that if the director or other author who takes part in the production of the film, or even performer, grants the producer by written contract his permission to fix such work or performance to first fixation. It shall automatically mean that the author or performer has granted the producer an exclusive and absolutely unrestricted license to use the work or performance within the film. And at the same time, the author or performer has right to receive remuneration in the habitual amount. That's the basic concept. At the same time, it means by Czech Copyright Act, if such written contract is agreed upon between author and producer, that the authors and also performers cannot withdraw from such a contract just due to change of their beliefs, let's say political beliefs or other beliefs, which is one of the basic rights of other authors outside the audiovisual industry. Another restriction in audiovisual industry is that automatically the producer can make almost any adaptation, publishing, editing, processing, and other work concerning the works and performances which are part of the film. He can even link it to another work or make it public under his, that is, performer's name. Also, the producer is deemed to have permission to complete the work or performance due to the early termination of the author's or performer's legal relationship with the producer, or even if the producer has so-called reasonable fears that the work or performance shall not be completed in time. And finally, unless otherwise agreed, the authors and performers whose works or performances were used within the film cannot grant right to another adaptation of such work or performance in the next 10 years. So that's it, and how we have seen from this short list, the producer basically can do almost anything with the work or performance, to say it in one sentence. However, what has to be stressed down is that there's almost unlimited room for both sides, for the producer and author or performer, to negotiate completely different conditions in the contract, more favorable to the author or to the performer. Now to the 7 major issues, perhaps most discussed in the negotiations, from my experiences at least. The first issue I would like to speak about is the issue of right versus obligation of the producer to use or non-use the license that he has bought out from the author or performer. Again, by law, in this case by civil code, the licensee, that is the producer, is generally obliged to utilize the license. He's generally obliged to use the right that he bought from the author or performer. However, in practice, in vast majority of cases, as far as I know, the license is negotiated not as binding, but as purely authorizing, which means that it's completely up to the producer if he or she decides to use the license or not. And it's nothing that the author can do about it, basically, from this point of view. However, if the license is exclusive, which is in the most cases in audiovisual industry, and the producer doesn't use the license at all, or he uses it insufficiently, then after 2 years' time, the author can ask the producer to start utilizing the license. And if the producer doesn't start to do so, then the author can withdraw. If the license was authorizing, then the author have to return the remuneration. If it was binding, as is the general case, as I said, according to the law, then the author can even keep the remuneration. However, again, the practice is that this time for the producer to not use the exclusive license is usually much more prolonged from the 2 years. So usually it's up to the producer to not use the license, for example, for 10 or even 15 or even longer period of years, or even longer period of time. The second issue, which also is very connected with perhaps the topic of this conference, which is also the digital single market, is the issue of flat versus share remuneration. Again, according to the law, it's totally up to the producer and author how they agree. If they agree on flat remuneration, once-time remuneration, or remuneration made by share by percentage, which the author will get from the producer's income. It's only up to them how they will agree, and both such agreements are equally valid. They can even combine both models, so the author gets flat share, the author gets flat remuneration, and at the same time some sort of share remuneration. We can say, and I know it's a simplification, but we can say that perhaps in most cases it can be more favorable for the author, ideally in combination with flat remuneration, to receive some share, and not only because in such case he obviously gets what the producers actually gets from the distribution, but what's perhaps even more important, the author in such case is entitled to obtain a billing statement from the producer, and even to inspect the accounting documentation of the producer. In case there's a flat remuneration, the author doesn't have such right, which is also something which could change according to the digital single market strategy, perhaps. The flat rate, on the other hand, could be, in many cases, more favorable to the producer, obviously because there is no administration for the producer connected with billing and generally administrating the share remuneration. However, at the same time, there's a risk for the producer that the author may claim the so-called reasonable additional remuneration, which in this case cannot be waived. So there cannot be other negotiation between the parties. And it's possible then that in such case the author, if his original flat remuneration was too low, will ask to get raise. As a footnote, I would only like to add that it's also crucial, and frequently it's not dealt in within the contracts, what are the exact maturity conditions of the remuneration. So sometimes there's a very detailed description of the remuneration, but you don't know from the contract, if you read it, when exactly the remuneration should be paid to the author. As a third issue, we can speak about the time, quantity, and other scope of the license which is sold by the author to the producer. I would say that it's a logical requirement of the producer, but also of you as the users and consumers of the audiovisual content, that the producer accumulates the widest possible range of rights within its hands. On the other hand, from the author's point of view, the problematic part is mainly if his or her reward does not match the range of rights which is sold to the producer. So perhaps the main point of negotiation concerning this issue is that the author can, for example, insist that he or she will not give such right which is clearly redundant for the case, or insufficiently rewarded from his point of view. So, for example, merchandising rights or rights of further adaptation, let's say a remake of popular screenplay. And for completeness sake, let's just say that it's invalid according to the Czech Copyright Act to grant a license to somebody which allows him to use the work in a way that is not known at the time of conclusion of the contract. As a fourth issue, I will mention possibilities of unilateral contract termination. Here, let's state that, again, by law, from the point of view of the statute, you can basically withdraw from the license agreement only if one of the parties, the second party, is in breach of the contract, usually material breach of the contract. However, in practice, in contracts, the parties negotiate usually much wider possibilities to withdraw from the contract, and usually in favor of the producer. So again, from the point of view of the author, it is necessary to balance the right of both parties to withdraw from the contract, and ideally, from his point of view, ideally to get the same chance to withdraw as the producer. Fifth topic, producers' right to interfere with author's work. Again, I would say it's quite legitimate for the producer to have right to interfere, and even by law it says that in all cases, not only in the audiovisual industry, it is possible for the licensee to modify the work if it could be expected that the author would agree. So it's not only in the audiovisual industry. However, it could be problematic if the interventions are from some perspective unacceptable for the individual author, like in the case of overall conceptual adaptation by the producer. Possible compromise in the contract then could be, which could be negotiated, create some sort of creative council whose members are also other key participants of the film, which decide bindingly what kind of interference to the work will be made. Sixth issue is transfer of rights from producer to a third party. Here I would say that, again, it's necessary for a producer to have the right to at least sub-license the rights he acquired from authors and performers to third parties to evaluate the investments, to have the right to, for example, sell the rights to video-on-demand portal or television. What is there to negotiate, nonetheless, is the right of the producer to transfer the rights above this basic right to sub-license, in particular to fully transfer the license to another third party. And finally, the final seven issue which I picked up concerning the negotiations of authors and producers is the author's obligation to edit the work. The main problem from the point of view of authors, as they tell me usually, is that there is virtually unlimited room for the producer to ask the author to revise the work, and when the author has no right to get any additional reward for such revisions, usually. Also, sometimes the authors complained that it's absolutely unclear who from the producer's team can give them instructions as how to implement or otherwise edit the work, and that somehow sometimes the comments are even contradictory. So for the author, I think it's ideal if there's a clear timetable of implementation and both editing of the work, and there are clear rules at how to adjust such a timetable. Also, if within the contract are identified concrete people who can ask the author to change the work and their hierarchy. And finally, of course, if there's some even additional rate for the author to get paid for the extra work. And finally, some conclusions. So as we have seen in the Czech Copyright Act, the producer automatically has very wide range of rights. However, as I said, it's absolutely up to the parties to differentiate or to negotiate completely differently from this legal basic concept and substantially change the balance in favor of the author. Therefore, we could say by one sentence that perhaps the Act only offers a menu of possibilities, and it's completely up to the parties to mutually achieve some satisfactory compromise. However, the reality is that to a large extent it's up to the negotiation on, you can say, power position of both parties, what can be negotiated. And if we speak about Czech Republic, the problem is, perhaps also as in other countries in the European Union, and unlike, for example, in the United States, that we have very weak, I could say, artistic trade unions. So every author is for his own in the negotiations, basically. And finally, final thought, perhaps not an original one. Both parties logically defend, I think, their own interests. However, I think their common interest is, or should be at least, to produce a good movie, and it cannot be achieved unless this balance, which I talked about, is found. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have very similar discussions in Austria. For the last presentation, I will welcome Mark, and now the pronunciation is a bit shaky, but I go ahead and try. Doos? Ha! Good. And he's from the University of Amsterdam and is giving a presentation of understanding the Me Too, Gamergate and pay gap in the gendered context of making media. And yeah, come on.
All right, thanks. Thank you so much, and thanks for being part of this panel, this all-male panel. And I'm going to talk about women, which is entirely inappropriate for an all-male panel, but so I apologize in advance. So this conference, this specific conference, I found really inspiring because it's about distribution. At least that's the overall theme that we're talking about, and that you've been talking. I regret that I've only arrived late. I just got in from the airport, and distribution is kind of an interesting thing. It seems to be on the top of the research agenda at the moment. of course, legitimizing this conference. On the other hand, Nicholas Garnham, one of the founders of our discipline in media industry and production studies, already wrote in 1990, which is some time ago, that if you want to study power, which is important in the media industry, as Ivan just, I think, really beautifully showed, you have to study distribution, not production. And what? So it's both important and tempting to focus on distribution and how money is made in this industry that we all love the products of. However, I would like to just step back just a little bit to focus our attention, or to say that we have a responsibility to focus our attention perhaps even more on production, not just to show how little power makers of media, including authors, actually have, because of course the real problem in these negotiations is that the authors have almost no power, in part because they fail to collectively organize, but also because their working conditions make it almost completely impossible to collectively organize. And there's as Angela McRobbie says, I mean, the working conditions and arrangements in the media industries are profoundly depoliticizing. And that strips you of power once you enter the negotiation room. And then, given the topic of my talk, if you're a woman on top of that, history shows you even have less negotiating power. For all kinds of reasons, and I'm not going to go into detail because I'm not going to talk for or about women here, but what I'm interested in is a couple of things that have happened in the last couple of years in different media industries that to me contribute to a moment, an opportunity to sort of, not just to talk about media production as, yeah, we should do that as well, but the real power is in distribution, but actually to recognize and acknowledge that power is in production, especially now, and especially when production seems to be now completely disappear into the hands of only a few global players, none of whom are media companies. So let's talk a little bit about the last couple of years. I would say since 2014. In the game industry, we have something called Gamergate. Now, I don't know how much you're into games or in the game industry, or you've heard about Gamergate, but for those of you who are new to this, Gamergate started in 2014 when a journalist, a game journalist, posted a long rant on a website, on his own blog, complaining about his ex. And his ex was a very talented young female game developer who just a year before released a game about depression, and which got a lot of great reviews and did very, very well indeed. So an independent game developer doing very well. They broke up, and he did what any stupid, ridiculous, asshole shit piece of a man does when he gets rejected, wrote a long post showing how awful she is. In that post, he suggested that she was behind his back having some kind of relations with another game journalist who then proceeded to write a favorable review of her game, hence her success, of course, has nothing to do with the fact that she's a very talented developer, but because she's sleeping with game journalists. The internet exploded, and men throughout the world started a complete witch hunt of this young woman, and she had to flee her home because they were doxing her. And doxing, as you know, is publishing somebody's personal information, including their home address, online. Now, she wasn't the only target. Like a whole bunch of other women in the game industry, including journalists, critics. Anita Sarkeesian is a very prominent female game critic. For example, she has a beautiful series of videos that you can find on YouTube showing the sexism in her. We've all played games. All the women had massive boobs and tiny little wrists, Tomb Raider, and so on and so forth. So the male gamers just went after these women, these successful, talented women that were beginning to get a voice in a traditionally very male-dominated industry. And I want to emphasize that we're beginning to get a voice. In other words, being producers of games that do well, being very visible as spokespeople for game studios and setting up their own studios, as prominent game critics and game scholars, and game journalists as well. Gamergate. It really forced the game industry also to acknowledge that it has a problem and that it needs to be doing better. One of my very dear friends is now the executive producer of a game studio in Amsterdam called Guerrilla Games. And I don't know if you noticed, but they released a game last year that broke every single record worldwide. And it's in a small independent studio. It's a game called Horizon Zero Dawn. It was made exclusively for the Sony PlayStation. Yeah, it's. Oh, I will tell her that. Angie Smets. Yeah. Oh, she would love to hear that. And we have regular discussions about this, and she really feels that something has significantly changed, and nobody now looks at her as like, hey, it's weird. You're a female game producer. No, she's one of the most powerful women in the industry, also setting up a division of the International Game Developers Association, specifically raising the issue of women in games, putting it on the agenda for annual conferences and so on and so forth. Then we have, and these are all hashtags as well as offline developments. Hashtag Gamergate and the Gamergate controversy. Then we have the hashtag pay gap. This came up this year, primarily when the BBC was audited by PricewaterhouseCoopers, showing massive pay gaps between male and female talent, as well as an underrepresentation of female talent, on-air talent, in the top ranks of the BBC. And that in and of itself is not that interesting, because most of us would respond to these findings, well, yeah, right? Female producers, female leads, female anchors, even if they're on TV, they're like half the age of their male colleagues, and they get paid, a pittance compared to them. But again, interesting how that immediately led to, BBC very publicly announcing that, okay, 188 people are going to get more money, male talent will have to surrender some of their pay privileges, and then these reports came in rolling in throughout the British industry and then other industries, including their American counterparts. The Hollywood pay gap issue came to fore. I mean, you may remember that movie, All the Money in the World, recent movie, where Kevin Spacey was edited out of the movie because of the Me Too allegations against him and scandal. And because of the Mr. Spacey's, ridiculous behavior, they had to reshoot a couple of scenes with two of the leads of the film, Michelle Williams and Mark Wahlberg. And some of you may have followed this news or heard about the news, but for those shoots, Mark Wahlberg was paid $1.5 million to come back to the studio and to do the reshoot, whereas Michelle Williams was paid $80 a day for a week's work. And when those numbers came out, of course, I mean, this is so incredible. And the difference was Mark Wahlberg just had a very clear contract that he signed from the beginning on. If there's any extra work, this is what it costs. So he was like, well, this is just my contract. That's what I negotiated. Whereas Michelle Williams had said, when she heard about the Kevin Spacey scandal, if there's more work to be done and the whole crew, everybody has to be reassembled, taking a break from their holidays, seeing their families and everything, I will do my part to make this movie happen. And you can pay me $80, which is sort of like a symbolic figure. It doesn't matter, I just want to support my colleagues. I'm not saying Mark Wahlberg, I mean, Mark Wahlberg ended up donating his money to the Time's Up movement in the US, raising awareness about underrepresentation of women in the film industry. Then maybe we watched the Oscars this year, that phenomenal speech by Frances McDormand mentioning an inclusion rider, a concept coined by a professor at the University of Southern California, suggesting that if you are in the privileged position like somebody like Frances McDormand is, or any of the other top female talent in the industry, but also male talent, you should negotiate for an inclusion rider, which is a segment in the contract that would state that you will only participate in this film if there's equality and diversity in the crew and on-screen talent. We've had similar trends. There's a movement across the screen industry. Again, you may have heard of it. It's called 50-50 by 2020. Right, this is the goal of that by 2020, male and female talent, regardless of where they are, above the line, below the line, would all be paid equally. Right, at the moment, the pay gap generally is about 80%. Women get paid 80% in the same role for the same work as their male counterparts in film and television, generally speaking. But last week, we had Salma Hayek at Cannes making this powerful statement saying, well, you know, men should take a pay cut in order to, because it's been calculated, if things go the way they have been going for the last 20 or 30 years between men and women, that the pay gap between men and women will be resolved by 2116. And that's a bit too long to wait. And as you may know, Salma Hayek founded 4 years ago the Women in Motion advocacy group, raising awareness about underrepresentation of women in film, together with her husband. Now, there's all kinds of stories to tell about this, and of course we have the hashtag #MeToo movement, starting in October 2017, when the first allegations against film producer Harvey Weinstein came out. As you probably know, MeToo has been an online rallying hashtag since 2006. But in 2017, it went viral because the movie industry and a lot of mainstream talent, starting with Alyssa Milano and then a whole bunch of other people, Kate Blanchett, among others, Jennifer Lawrence, started tweeting this and raising awareness about not the pay gap or underrepresentation, but sexual harassment, rape, misogyny, sexism, all kinds of stuff that happens to women daily in the film and across the screen industries. Now, I could go on for a while, but what to me is really fascinating is what makes all these things in the last couple of years different from similar issues that have been raised about, in this case, women, but you can extend this to marginalized people, professionals in the production industries in general, is the difference is the force with which this is now happening. Something is actually really changing. And not just because Disney made the most money that it's ever made in its history with movies featuring almost exclusively black people or powerful women, female leads, Wonder Woman and Black Panther, right? That's nice, that's wonderful, and high five to Disney, but it's part of a much broader phenomenon. So it's really, I mean, to study this now is not to study, you know, discrimination and it's so sad and it's poor and we need more diversity. No, it's to study a complete change in how the industry organizes itself and what kind of movies and films and television shows can actually get made these days. And it's really exciting, and this is the reason for my talk today, my intervention. I think it's our responsibility, because coming back to distribution, and then I'll close my comments for today. The literature on distribution, to me, is really worrying, because it talks about how production is actually not relevant anymore. Chris Bilton is a colleague of ours that most of you will probably know at the University of Warwick, and his latest book talks about the disappearing product, right? Product as something that is interesting to study and to cover and to pay attention to in the media industry is disappearing, because everything is about distribution. Everything is about the frightful five, right? Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and Alphabet, and those kind of things. So there's no more power to be found in the product. The product is almost irrelevant. Everything is about how to get to the people, to consumers that are all online on their social media and take content for granted. And the industry is very skillfully exploiting this. So I find it interesting that when in the production area, there is not just more voice, but more power to be found now for real change, that the industry and subsequently scholars are saying, yeah, well, to hell with that. Let's focus on Facebook. Like European parliamentarians yesterday or the day before, because we think that's sexy and we want to have a selfie with Mark Zuckerberg. I said, fuck Facebook. We should look at the people who make content, almost exclusively, I would say, because there's something happening there. I mean, another concept that is bandied around in the literature on distribution is the new commodity form. And what's the new commodity form in media industry and production studies? It's the audience, not just the audience, it's data about the audience. So instead of us, for example, caring about the human beings who make media, or caring about the communities that we want to reach with our media, we start caring about untouchable, invisible digital entities and data. And somehow that's where we now should be focused on and focus our scholarly energies on. Now, I'm not saying that that's not important. It's tremendously important, especially for the economic survival of media industries. However, I would like to go back to real human beings, both in the audience as well as among producers. I think we have a responsibility to recognize the struggle that's going on, not in terms of its marginalization, but in fact of its new power shift. And I find that truly exciting. And I'll end with a short pitch. Where do these thoughts and comments come from? From research that we've been doing for the last couple of years and put together in a book that I'm editing together with my dear friend and colleague Mirjam Prenger at the University of Amsterdam, who yesterday won an award for offering the best master's course of the university, that I'm incredibly proud of her work and the work of her team. We're putting a book together called Making Media, which is almost exclusively about what does all of this mean to the human beings who are entering the industry or are already there and try to make it work as media makers. So with that said, thanks for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. Yes, Aram, go ahead. We already know the procedure.
So thank you for three fascinating, detailed, and very different papers. I think it's interesting to see what kinds of themes reverberated across all three of your talks, despite those differences. So first of all, I think there's a common theme here that comes out of both the kind of legal and the critical, which is this notion that our understanding of authorship and individuality are fundamentally at odds with the kind of collectivity that we're seeing emerging in global media markets and online communities. So that takes place in the form of CRM, where we see the kind of roll-up of rights being creating tensions with our understanding of sole authorship and with the kind of droit moral that, especially in European law, adheres to the individual creator. We see that in the case of industries like cinema and games, where products are not the result of one individual's vision, but rather emerge out of collective productive behaviors and institutions. And I think we also see the flip side of that, the obverse, when you're talking about consumer data as the new commodity form for online media. It's information that only has meaning in its collective form, right? Individual data is valueless, separate from other people's data. So it seems to me that our language is beggared, that our whole conceptualization of communication and of media as connective tissues between individuals no longer fits the reality on the productive side or on the consumption side or on the monetization side. And because of that, we're creating all of these kinds of tensions in our legal systems as well as our social and cultural systems that can't be easily resolved. It's not as much as picking a winner. Now, there's another theme that comes out of all three of your talks, which I think is directly relevant to that, which is this instrument called the contract, right? It's something all of you talked about in very different ways. And what is a contract, really, except a way for individuals engaged in a collective enterprise to overcome the shortcomings of our legal system and of our social conceptualizations, right? So when you, when you have a contract, between an author and a producer, like you were talking about, copyright law doesn't stipulate where the author's power ends and the producer begins. That's all negotiated in the contract. And there's a certain amount of deference that the law gives to individuals to work those details out themselves, right? Lawmakers recognize that they shouldn't have the power to micromanage those interpersonal relationships. They should just circumscribe them. It's the same thing with what Mark was talking about, again, on the obverse with contracts like inclusion riders, where people are intentionally using contractual power, which is handed down as a form of individual agency by lawmakers, to address social inequities that ramify all the way back up the chain. Social inequities that are not even being recognized, let alone effectively countered by existing law, right? So this notion of of contract as a kind of interstitial tissue that allows us to negotiate between individual and collective, individual and institution, I think is a really interesting theme to emerge from all your work. And then, of course, the most obvious unifying theme is the notion of power imbalances adhering to those relationships between individuals, collectives, and institutions. And the limited ability that we have to understand the power structures in which we're imbricated, and then to have a role in renegotiating those power structures through our individual relationships. I think there's a silver lining, right, in all of these stories, right? Even in the case of, collective licensing and collective rights management, there are I really like how you talked about the kind of counterintuitive notion that it might actually be detrimental to individual or independent players in the market by virtue of the fact that they don't have the leverage to bypass the terms of the blanket contracts, right? So I think, what emerges from all this is that we're entering into an era where maybe the only viable form of law is contractual law, right? And that the kind of legal structures recede to the point of being almost meaningless, other than in their ability to lend actionability to the contracts that people enter into. So I guess the question that I'll lead off with, and I'm interested to hear what people have to ask, is what opportunity for agency do you see specifically to right the power imbalances that you identify? I mean, Mark, you talked a little bit about about like inclusion writers, but how can we, well, let me even back that up a little bit. Should the state do a better job of setting the terms that by which individuals, collectives, and institutions connect to one another? And if they don't, how do you see the role of these interstitial mechanisms like contracts offering a space of agency to people who are historically on the losing end of these power struggles?
Do you want direct, any direct reactions?
Please.
Well, I would say that I would be happy actually to live in a world where the role of contracts would be dominant, but actually I think that we are going to the opposite direction, at least in Europe. There's really an over-regulation, although this commission is not as that bad as the Barroso's commission, which really was, they were making plenty of legislation and regulations and over-regulating everything, which is, of course, reducing the play field for the individuals to interact and to make their own laws, which are the contracts. And this is a development which makes me, scared, because I like the I like to draw a similarity to the late Roman Empire, where there was an abundance of regulation, and one was contradicting the other, and it was a phenomenon which was marking the end of the empire and the loss of values and also like basically the distortion of the empire, and it started basically with early on in the second century, and early commentators like Seneca, they were writing about like how this abundance of laws makes it worse, and that it's not a law anymore if you have such an abundance of regulation. So whenever I am asked, I'm saying, well, no more regulation, no more laws, and please, really, because if you are trying to rectify any problems through legislation, you are doing it usually only worse, because first, the law has no time to develop. You have no time to develop the case law, to develop the doctrine. The scholars cannot write about it, because until they write about it, and it's changed already because someone in the commission wants to rectify a problem. And if I'm asking what's the solution will really be to slow down with legislation, and I'm of the opinion that no new technology is a requirement for a new legislation, because the law, basically, if it's well written, should be adapted through interpretation and so on. So often it's because the Commission wants to keep itself busy, but unless there's really a necessity to enact, because the rule is that you have to enact the new legislation only if it's necessary, really. So I'm not sure if I answered that question, but with talking about people who are on the loose, or who are the individuals, that was part of the topic, that because they were associated in collecting organizations, but now you have corporations which take their rights, and they because it's they found a better business model for themselves, but at the end it might be detrimental not only to those individuals but to the culture as such, and we ended up in this situation in Europe. And yeah, well.
Well, I basically agree with my colleague, but I will only adapt that it's not only about how much laws are made, but also in favor of whom they are made. And perhaps the problem is that there's a combination of these two problems, that there is too much laws in favor of too little, perhaps, in some cases. And for example, about the topic I talk about, and of course you also talk about it, the let's say natural inequality of some social, let's say, players, which can be on one hand authors or producers, or also men and female in sort of way. Then I think that there's really there should be an active role of state, perhaps, to belittle the difference as much as possible. But of course, it's perhaps made somehow redundantly and not very happily, as my colleague said. Yeah.
These are great answers. You asked what are the opportunities for agency, and that's a really important question. And we can look at specific opportunities for agencies in specific industries at specific moments. For media workers, for example, to have power. One of my favorite examples is it comes from the game industry. Like the game industry, if you want to get a game, if you want people to play your game on an Xbox or on a Sony PlayStation, I mean, you are a slave to Microsoft and Sony. So there's no agency whatsoever. But as you know, every 4 or 5 years or so, there's a new iteration of the console. And in that window, Sony and Microsoft are desperate to get original content. like Horizon Zero Dawn, was specifically commissioned by Sony because it wanted to have a game that it could say to consumers, this is unique to our PlayStation and it uses PlayStation technology in a way that you cannot find on an Xbox and also not on an older PlayStation. Which gave Guerrilla Games, as a small studio, they got 5 years to develop this, which is unheard of. But so they had agency because there was a transition moment. Okay, but that's maybe too specific. In a general sense, very quickly, I would say, as to the role of the state, I totally agree. Fewer laws, and specifically in both in copyright and tax laws, making it easier for independent workers to organize, to collectively bargain, even if they're not part of the same company or same production. Right now, that's still, in most places that I know of, I'm not a legal scholar, but incredibly complicated and hard. If you're not already inside a certain company or production, you're on your own. And that is too black and white. That doesn't do justice to the very networked and fragmented way the labor market for media work is actually organized. I mean, in terms of the industry, and you see this happening. I mean, the industry has to realize that it's always been a very precarious balance between the media industry as a distinctly commercial industry. It wants to make profit, but also an industry that has a profound social responsibility, right? It has an influence. And I think that there's more and more calls from society, from various domains in the of society, on that responsibility role. And I do think that's something the industry can be called upon. Like yes, you have a responsibility to your shareholders, but also to the community, and to your workers.
So what's the leverage? Is it just the market? Like, is it just the power of the wallet?
No, I mean, the one thing that I found hopeful in the 10 years that I worked and lived in the US and studied the industry up close and over there is that I found quite a few companies in various industries, whether it's recording studios or record labels, or advertising agencies, that actually were trying to make a difference or trying to be attractive to talent by their labor policies. By the amount of freedom and amount of support they would give their workers, and say, well, even in the game studio, or there was a game studio that doesn't exist anymore, but at the time I did my research for Media Work, a book I did in 2007, there was one games in the studio who was very proud in announcing they were the first media company in the world that had a full-time person on staff whose job it was to make the lives of the workers better. So it was a quality of life manager. So he would organize Friday barbecues and a monthly sort of whale watching trip, or family Fridays where the workers could bring in the family to work and hang out and stuff like that. So I have yet to see that in a quality newsroom. But so the industry has a responsibility, professional associations have responsibilities to, unions have traditionally represented people who are already in, so people who have jobs. But then again, everybody in the industry, in the media industry, works but doesn't have jobs. And how do you organize for them? And I know in the Netherlands, there's and also to some extent in the US and elsewhere, there's a serious movement going on of new ways of organizing, formally and informally. And I do feel professional associations have a very powerful role to play here and can create some agency. Then, I'm assuming most of us here, all of us teach in universities and professional schools and everything. We have a responsibility too. One of the most remarkable things that has happened in the last 5 to 10 years is that almost every university in the world has sort of built up these media and creative industries programs and lured students with the promise of easy jobs in television and direct lines to internships and set up studios, and these websites are incredibly cool, and there's media schools and all that kind of stuff. And where in all of this is the critical voice? I love this stuff, right? But it needs to be balanced with, and I don't see people advertising that. And this is specific in the UK, but I think internationally as well. The lure of social recognition for the university and the money brought in by especially foreign students to come up with a sort of industry program that is almost completely skills and competence. So it's instrumentalist.
You just described the revisions I just made tonight.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I should.
Ivan, Film Europe, gentlemen, thank you very much. Rudolf, Ivan, excellent remark from the lawyer, less law. That's incredible. Mark, I'm a distributor, so sorry about it. Just a little remark, actually. In between the authors and the audience, we are having actually even more steps than just the producer and distributors. And since I'm a distributor, actually my game changer is a relationship with the agent, with the sales agent. So we are having authors, we are having producers, we are having sales agents, we are having distributors, and then I am dealing with another gatekeepers, which are cinemas, obviously, or platforms, right? So how to tackle this is impossible by law, right?
Yeah.
So we all know that we need less law, but the societies or cultures which are having less laws are definitely not Euro-Atlantic civilizations, right? We are actually based on the myriads of the laws which are actually your game field, right? And what is the solution, right? If you have a society which are glued together by trust and the common motivation, then of course you should have less law, right? Okay, but you know the penalty. It's either Sharia or traditional societies, right? So how to way out from this is a question to you guys, and you are having 1 minute to answer, right? Mark, what a speech! Thank you very much. I love to fuck Facebook. Tell me how. I love to be in bloody sex with them, but tell me how. How should I avoid this? I'm a distributor, right? How Mr. Michelangelo or Da Vinci should avoid church in the time he or she made his work to be distributed to the public. I mean, if the church was powerful there, then the Facebook is actually the church of today. How I should avoid this? And you are having 2 minutes to answer that. Thank you very much.
Well, let me demonstrate it on an example. What I mean by less laws, and I really think that the development of the society is not based on the number of laws. For instance, discrimination we talked about. Jesus, we don't need any anti-discrimination directive. This is only a way for a government or a commission or whoever to proclaim that we have solved the problem because we have now anti-discrimination law. But we had anti-discrimination law even before there was an anti-discrimination directive on any special statute. It's written in the constitution that people are equal, and it's written in the civil code. So instead of having a new law which says the same and which is only making a mess of the legal system with any new law, you should focus on educating employees what their rights are, educating judiciary what the law is, what the principles are, and how they should, judge. And the focus should be on the enforcement and on executing these tasks, which is much more complicated than to enact a law. So that's what I mean by less laws. It does not mean really that there will be less law, because the more the society is developed, the more there is law in terms of interaction, and so it is complex, but you don't have to have a statute for every single specific problem. So that was my idea.
I agree.
So what to do with Facebook? So interestingly, we've just learned that the Delete Facebook campaign was had the opposite effect, right? More people signed up to Facebook than ever before. So what can you do in the age of Facebook if you want your work to get out there? Well, there's a couple of things here. I mean, both using Facebook and avoiding Facebook. The one thing that I find really encouraging is to look at media work and media production and media distribution on local levels. We've done some case studies in the last book that Angela McRobbie did. She did some really strong case studies in, for example, in Italy and in Germany, showing how when media workers on a local level work with local communities and they're not necessarily interested to get national or international distribution going, they can achieve really amazing results, both in terms of, you know, paying the bills as well as doing meaningful work. And for that, you don't need Facebook necessarily. So then there's ways to use Facebook that, I mean, one thing that Facebook is really good for are closed groups, which are used by, you know, refugees, as well as journalists sharing leads and helping each other out, or other kind of media professional communities, where your data and your still goes to Facebook, but it's not part of the main platform. That doesn't make it all right within Facebook, but it's a way of using it I shouldn't say strategically, tactically. And finally, I must admit that for me, all the discussion currently about Facebook and Facebook Cambridge Analytics has a bit of a media hype quality to it. I mean, yes, it's a massive company. Yes, 2.5 billion people are signed up to its service. But, and this is a horribly unscientific observation, but I had a chance to spend some time at Facebook earlier this year, in February, just before the Cambridge stuff hit, and talked to a lot of people who work there, and spend about 4 days in its offices, and the impression that I got away with is what an incredible mess this company is. A very commercially successful mess and a very corporate mess, but a mess and a mess that is actually internally celebrated. Which also means that this company is not the same company today as it was yesterday. It constantly changes. It's almost impossible to manage and to oversee, which is, to me, to some extent exciting, and to some extent very scary. But that also means it's not the monolith of the past. It's not, in that sense, it's very different from the church. And this sounds a bit naively hopeful, but yes.
You know who made the order in the Cambridge Analytica? That's the basic point.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's the third part. Very well.
Johanna?
Thank you all. I have a very obvious question for Rudolf and Ivan. What gender-related issues do you typically come across in your legal practice? If there are any, like while helping people with contracts?
Well, you know, when we are talking about statutes and the laws are written in this country by old white male people, and there's an inherent gender bias in the law, I must say. But it's not perhaps in the law, but it's really more in the statute. And I like to make the distinction, because the statute is not the law. The law is how the statute is applied and interpreted, and so on. So there is some bias in the law, although not really in the copyright laws, I would say. I can't think of something like that in the copyright law, but you can find it in, for instance, in criminal law, in how you know, crimes against women are handled differently from crimes against men, and so on. So, but there has been some development in the last time. Concerning my practice, I don't really encounter these issues that much, or I can't at least now think of any. But the problem there with law drafting or statute drafting is there, and yeah, but at least we know about it now, and we can do something about it. And it's also about the problem with the judiciary, the biased sort of decision making. But nowadays in the Czech Republic, at least in the judiciary, there's maybe majority of women. That's also interesting because at the Supreme Court bench there are all men nearly. In the Constitutional Court the same, but on the lower levels, so there is obviously a problem if there are most female judges, but not in the high courts. So.
And is it really a problem? Do you think that a female judge makes different decisions than male judge from your point of view? Really? And
when analyzing the judicial and at least if I talk about my litigation practice, you can forget about the law. Basically, what decides the dispute is like who is there the good guy, who's the bad guy, who has the sympathies of the judge, and so on. And this is pretty much depending on who is the judge, and if it's an older lady or an older man, and who is who gets the sympathies or not. So at least on the trial level, on the first instance, this makes an important part of the decision. And I would say that the judge, and the judges would not like to hear that, but the judge really knows the outcome of the case when he or she sees the people in the courtroom, and usually the decision, because in our country the decision is written only ex post. So first the judge decides and only then writes the decision. So often it's like in the written opinion, it's finding arguments for a decision which I already made 1 year ago. Well, this is a little bit extreme sort of position, but it's really close to that at least.
Anyway, I must disappoint you because I also don't know about any gender problems in copyright law. Actually, in my practice, I think that the law is, let's say, just and unjust in the same ways to men and women. Not? Okay, then perfect. Thank you. Okay.
So there are no explicit gender biases that I know of in copyright law, but there are long-standing social and cultural differences in modes of sociality in the way that women cooperate and socialize, in contrast to the way that men cooperate and socialize. And what's true is that a lot of the organizations of production and the fields of production that are traditionally feminized, at least in my culture and country, have less copyright protection than the fields that are traditionally dominated by men. For instance, textiles and quilting. Quilting is a collective activity typically undertaken by groups of women in the United States, and quilts have not historically enjoyed the same kind of copyright protection that some other textiles can. There's a very famous case which had to do with the quilters of East Bend, which are rural African-American, multi-generational women in Alabama. And there was a long-standing court case that was ultimately settled, I think, between them and two brothers, two white men, who commercialized their work through an art exhibition and some books. You could also look at something like food. Food is a form of expression that is, again, broadly speaking, feminized in American culture that does not enjoy the same kind of copyright protection that other modes of production have. I could go on. It's subtle, but I think it's there.
Okay, please.
No, there's one in the back. And while you... Okay. Okay. I just wanted to corroborate or support what you said, that there's no obvious bias, but if you look at copyright industries, it is fairly obvious that we are talking about the superstar industries. So if you look at superstars and the distribution, as Mark also said in his talk, the distribution between male and female superstars is different. So I'm pretty sure that if you look at the Gini coefficient, so the coefficient about the income distribution, even if you just take the top 1 percentile, will be very, very different. And this, of course, is amplified by the law. So it's not unjust in its principle, but how it's used and applied, I'm pretty sure that you can find this amplification of a gender bias there as well.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
I would also add to that there's just sort of inequalities in ownership of intellectual property. If you look at the numbers of executive producers on television who are the main profit participants in production, I think it's like 85% are men and 15% are women, which kind of actually goes to my point about, I'm going to take the bait, Mark, about distribution versus production, because I'm definitely a distribution stan. And I think there's a kind of widespread ignorance about distribution in our society that's highly problematic. I'll give you a concrete example. So in my presentation today, I run a platform called OTV. I run a distribution platform. I think actually doing distribution allows us as scholars to get a view into production, but also reception and how those two relate or don't relate. But there's been like over 100 articles written about OTV. Of those, maybe 5 are about OTV. The rest of them, over 100, are about our individual shows and artists, which is great. Like, they need the shine, right? But like, the project is about correcting inequalities in media, and that's not going to happen unless distributors view it as a priority. We know from other studies that sets that are run by women and people of color are less sexist and racist, right? And who orders those productions? They're distributors, right? They're the ones who decide who the show creators are, and then the show creator from the top sets the culture, right? So if Netflix decided today to say, we will not give a series order to anyone who has allegations against them for sexual assault, you could drastically reduce the rate of harassment claims in the United States, because there's fewer distributors, right? There's all these production companies, and they're in the mode of selling. They're trying to actually get the sale. So they'll hire Kevin Spacey if that's what Netflix says. But if Netflix is like, don't do House of Cards with Kevin Spacey does not get hired, because they're the ones who control the dollars. So I'm constantly trying to tell people in my community, like, if you want to change media, you've got to hold the distributors accountable. Otherwise, you're not going to get systemic change. And most of them still think OTV is a studio, right? They don't even understand that we're a distributor. I'm trying to explain to people that we don't produce things. But people have no sense of like the fact that when you watch something on FX, it's not necessarily, well, all these distributors now also take intellectual property. So it's getting complicated. So I understand why they're confused, but I think that, you know, social change has to start with those distributors, because otherwise the industry is so fragmented. Everyone's just going to be doing whatever they can to get the sale and not actually doing something that's socially beneficial.
Thank you. There was no question, right? Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, we would wrap up. There's one comment I wanted to make still, because there was this cry for less laws. I don't think that's, I wouldn't agree with that. I think it needs laws that are much clearer, and this can be very easily shown with copyright and the changes in copyright, or not in copyright, but in its applications. So if you go back 25 years, there was, as a consumer, you literally couldn't violate copyright. I mean, of all the things you could do, how could you, as a private person, violate copyright? You can make private copies and hand them on, but that was covered usually by some kind of levy. You could make a party in your own home, playing records and asking for an entrance fee. So that's about the size of it, how you could possibly violate copyright. So copyright basically made the rules for the creators, the producers, the distributors. But as a consumer, it didn't touch you. Now you have many ways to violate copyright as a consumer. And this is something when the realm of the law, when the scope of the law gets so broad where it needs drastic measures and new ways of dealing with it, and especially simplification. Simplification in a way that I can understand it as a consumer. It's okay for the industry to have a complex right because they're all lawyered up. But as a consumer, I don't have to be. I can't be. And so that is where I don't think we need less law. Less law. I think we just need much clearer laws and adapt. Right. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Peter and Johanna and Pavel for the great conference. Everybody who stayed in the cave until now. So there's light outside, but not yet. I want to give the microphone to Peter, who wanted to make a few announcements, and thank you.
Thank you. So I will not try to summarize the conference. I will just say that I'm really extremely happy with how it went, and we'll get in touch with you about the publishing projects. Two of them, we already talked about that. But I would also like to thank the other people who took part in the organization, especially the students whom you see around here under the management of Jiří Anger, who is over there on the left, and this was Daniela, Filip, Jan, Petra, Martin and Terezie, so we could not do that without them, so thank you very much. And thank you all again for coming to Prague. I wish you pleasant stay until the end of the ICA conference for those of you who are staying. Thanks again, and maybe see you next year. We'll go on with this conference. Next year will be number 8. Thanks a lot.